we're continuing to monitor this and see where it goes. But at this point, the president of Mexico is not going to play ball anymore. I heard the president say we have a $60 billion trade deficit with Mexico or something along those lines. There are lots of ways for them to get the money that would have gone to Mexico and just never send it there and spend it on the wall. That's what I think is going to end up happening. One way that it may not be, I've never believed, and I'm not sure Donald Trump has ever believed, that it would be Mexico writing us a check or paying in truckloads of pesos. I've never really thought that's how that was going to go down. And if you did, I think that you've been in Colorado or you're on medical marijuana. One of the two. There's something wacky going on there if that's what you believe is going to go on. The other thing that the president talked about today was building the wall, and He talked about it in relation to not only immigration, but also the problems he's having with sanctuary cities. Let's go to cut number 32, Rose, where President Trump's talking about this issue. Listen.
We've put in place the first steps in our immigration plan, ordering the immediate construction of the border wall, putting an end to catch and release, expediting the removal of criminal this is so important to me. From day one, I've said it. And I mean the immediate removal of criminal aliens. They're going to be gone fast. And finally, at long last, cracking down on sanctuary cities. It's time to restore the civil rights of Americans, to protect their jobs, their hopes, and their dreams for a much better future.
So there's the president and his discussion on cracking down on sanctuary cities. Liberal mayors across the country are melting down today over what he said. I'll have some of that sound for you coming up here in just a couple of minutes. First, let's get to Mr. Hans von Spakovsky, who is, of course, a legal fellow with the Heritage Foundation. Hans, how are you, sir?
Marc, I'm doing all right.
I'm glad to hear that. You know, I've listened to this debate about the sanctuary cities over the past months, and it amazes me that these mayors seem to think that they can do whatever they want when it comes to ignoring federal law.
Yeah, you know, it reminds me of Southern mayors in the late 1950s and early 1960s who thought they could defy federal law on desegregation and racial discrimination. Very familiar, isn't it?
It is very familiar, and you know, I've never been a big fan of the federal government blackmailing states. I'm a big states' rights guy. I really believe in that, but I think there's a difference between blackmailing states like they did over the speed limit back in the 70s. If you didn't bring your speed limit down to 55, we're gonna withhold some of your federal highway funds and stuff like that, versus this, which deals directly with the enforcement of federal laws.
Oh, look, you're absolutely right, because what the federal government and the Trump administration is saying to these states and these cities is you cannot obstruct the enforcement of federal law, because that's what they're doing. And let me give you an example of what I mean. Most of these sanctuary cities have put in a policy that says when our local law enforcement, our sheriff, our police officer, when they arrest an individual, they cannot notify the federal government if it turns out the person is an illegal alien. Well, that is a direct violation of federal law. There's a federal immigration provision that says no local or state government can forbid its officials from exchanging information on the citizenship status of any individual with the federal government. So by not notifying the federal government when they've got an illegal alien, and telling their law enforcement they can't do that, they are trying to obstruct enforcement of federal immigration law, and you can't do that.
Yeah, that's a great point. You know, I mentioned this the other day. I remember when Jan Brewer and the state of Arizona tried to allow local police to ask immigration status upon pulling somebody over for a different violation, a moving violation, and the Supreme Court slapped him on the wrist over that, or at least some federal court did, and said, no, you can't do this because you can't override federal laws on immigration. Is that correct? Is that not how that went down?
What happened is you're exactly right. Look, Arizona put in a provision said that if a police officer, when he arrests somebody, has a reasonable suspicion that they may not be a U.S. citizen, they are obligated to contact the federal government about them. The Obama administration went to court and tried to stop that. The Supreme Court said, no, that's perfectly valid because of the provision that I just mentioned. The provision of federal law says you can't forbid local officials from talking to the federal government about immigration status. So actually, the Obama administration lost that. Now, there were other parts of that law that were knocked out by the Supreme Court, but that specific provision, that was upheld by the court.
Yeah, I don't know if you heard this or not. Listen to the mayor of New York, de Blasio, and a few of the other mayors who held a news conference talking about how outraged they were over this announcement by the president. Listen.
Regardless of where they come from and regardless of their documentation status.
I'm disturbed and angered by the news out of Washington, D.C. We will not be intimidated by the threat to federal funding. We have each other's backs, and we have the Constitution of the United States of America on our side. We will do everything lawful in our power to protect you. If necessary, we will use City Hall itself to shelter and protect anyone who's targeted unjustly.
I think the key, as I listen there, is right at the end. He flusters a lot, and then he said, "We'll try to protect anybody who's targeted unjustly." But this law, correct me if I'm wrong, is if somebody is harboring an illegal alien, can't the elected officials in that state be held responsible for that?
Well, they can't be forced to arrest somebody because they are in the country illegally. But what they can't do is hide people who are here illegally, and they can't refuse to inform federal authorities about somebody they have who's in the country illegally.
Yeah, I just asked about that because I was thinking back to that Kate Steinle situation. This was somebody who'd been deported, who should never have been here to begin with. But if a city like San Francisco is harboring this individual, that's just wrong. And let me ask this separately, Hans. Do they have a leg to stand on legally to fight the federal government over federal funds that are withheld?
No, they don't, because the money that the Trump administration is talking about cutting off are federal grant programs administered by the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice. And almost all of those programs, the Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland Security, they have absolute discretion on which cities to award those funds to. And if a city is violating federal law, of course the Attorney General can cut off money to them. The cities don't have a leg to stand on legally if they go to court.
That's interesting. Off this subject of sanctuary cities for a moment, kudos to you. I saw where you were quoted in the Wall Street Journal on this election fraud claim by the president. And I thought you made a very valid point about it. Everybody throws their hands up and say, well, I've never heard of that. It must not be true. But has there ever the point you made, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's never really been a true investigation into some of these claims.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, for example, a couple of years ago, the Pew Foundation put out a study saying, well, they had looked at voter registration lists across the country. 1.8 million people who are dead are still on the rolls. They didn't take the next step of checking the voter history of that 1.8 million people to see whether, in fact, they had continued to vote after they were dead, which would be a clear indication of fraud. The few times that's been done, you may recall, Mark, right before the election, remember a CBS TV station in Colorado, another CBS station in L.A., they actually did that. And they found hundreds of people who were dead, who were still on the voter rolls, and who had continued to vote in multiple elections.
Well, there's going to be egg on somebody's face if they launch this investigation. We know that one way or the other. So I hope that they do it in earnest and they try to get to the bottom of some of those cases. Hans von Spakovsky, thanks for your time today.
Sure, anytime, Mark.
I appreciate it. Always a pleasure talking to you. Hans is legal expert with the Heritage Foundation. You can go to read more of his thoughts there at heritage.org. And, of course, occasionally you see him quoted in papers like the Wall Street Journal. So I was glad to see his name in there. Glad that Jeff Allen pointed that out to me earlier. So good. All right, lots coming.